He was poised above the paper like a judge about to pass sentence. Jackson Hale's hand hovered over the pen. The 27th floor boardroom hummed with the kind of confident silence that belonged to people who signed things without looking back. Floor-to-ceiling glass swallowed the city below. A projector glowed. A tray of untouched scallops waited for a toast no one would stop to make. Then a small voice cut through it. "That clause, right there, puts the liability back on Hale Investments after the merger." The room went thin as a blade. People turned. A woman in a tailored suit's laugh died before it left her throat. Jackson's pen stopped. Across the mahogany table, a man who'd made a career of eating risk for breakfast tightened his jaw. Maya Williams stood at the edge of the polished conference room, badge-clipped, crooked to a shirt 2 sizes too small, Janitor's cart parked in the hallway like an accusation. She wore sneakers borrowed from a friend to avoid the scuff of her own shoes in the marble. Her palms were full of photocopies, pages the company had not meant for someone like her to read. They all saw the badge first and the audacity second. Security rose like a ripple. Someone whispered the word, "Trespass." Clara Hale, Jackson's wife, met Maya's gaze with an expression that was all policy and cost accounting. "You can't be here," a voice said, cold and efficient. Maya pointed with a paper-stained finger. She said the words not as an accusation, but as fact. "If you sign this, you assume the liabilities the other company is leaving behind. That clause makes Hale Investments responsible for their debts and claims. It flips the liability." Jackson's hand trembled fractionally. The pen hovered. No one moved to take it. In that tiny electric silence, the future of a deal worth a fraction of the company's market cap hung by the end of a sentence. They escorted her out. The security guard's hand on her elbow felt like a deadline. Maya's voice didn't rise. She repeated the sentence as if saying it a second time would make it less preposterous. "It flips the liability." Outside the boardroom, the corridor swallowed her like an apology. The pen stayed, the signature undone. 8 hours before, in a different kind of silence, the building smelled of bleach and late-night coffee. Denise Williams hummed under the fluorescence, a practiced rhythm of broom and cloth. Night shift at Hale Investments had the company's pulse on loop. A parking attendant who took pride in retrieving lost umbrellas, a security guard who knew every elevator's quirks, and Denise, who took the trash out and made sure nobody forgot what gets left behind. Maya had been 17 months into the role people called night assistant, a title that, like janitor, did not account for the way she read things. She knew the copier like a neighborhood. She knew how to get multiple feeds, how to pull the jam without setting off the machine's temper. She had been young the day her grandfather told her, "Words are the strong ones. People forget faces. They never forget the thing a paper says." That night, the copier spat out a sheaf of pages with the stubborn honesty of an old machine. Maya slid a stack of proposals into a manila folder to recycle. One page clung. A final draft banner stared up at her like a dare. She had no business reading it. She read it anyway. At first, it looked like 100 other agreements, definitions, warranties, appendices so thick they could be used as a wedge. But then a sub-paragraph pried at her attention. Legal text moves slowly if you don't live in it. For most people, it's ocean. For Maya, it was a stream she'd learned to walk across. Buried in dense sentences, like a worm in an apple, was a clause that assigned responsibility for legacy liabilities to Hale Investments under certain structurally triggered events. In plain language, after the merger, Hale would inherit the debts and pending claims that the acquiring company wanted to leave behind. It wasn't bolded, circled, or called out. It was a trap. She read it twice. Her stomach went thin, the way it did when something was wrong at work and no one else noticed. She photocopied the page. The copier coughed, and gave it back like a secretive ally. Denise noticed her daughter's furrowed brow. "You okay?" Denise asked, while rinsing a coffee can. Maya showed the paper. Denise squinted, worried more about what a confrontation could do than about the clause itself. "We can't bring this up. Not to the managers. Not like this," she said. In Denise's life, survival was knowing when to speak and when to wait for the safe hour. Yet she also knew the kind of pride that sat in Maya's shoulders, quiet and relentless. "People get hurt by agreements they don't read," Maya said. She wasn't angry, she was precise, like one of the machines she tended. "It's written so you don't see it." Denise put a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You can tell me anything, but you're a kid. You don't have to carry the company," she said. Maya thought about the kids in her neighborhood whose mothers worked second jobs because a company had called something assumed risk and then quietly reassigned it. She thought of Mr. Torres down the hall who'd lost his small supply business when a claim clung to him like rust. Responsibility, she had learned, had a shape to it. It could be moved. She kept the photocopy in her backpack. The next morning, the building smelled different under the sun. The janitorial cart glinted. Maya clocked in, keeping to the routes that made her invisible, vacuuming the outer offices, refilling the soap. She watched meetings from doorways the way other people watch TV. She watched Clara Hale cross the atrium in shoes that must have cost more than their rent. She watched Jackson, whose handshake sealed acquisitions, whose breakfast never arrived on his desk unless someone brought it in just before a board meeting. When she saw the logistics for the merger, an internal memo about final approval at noon, Maya decided she would not be invisible that day. She had no right to be in the boardroom. She also had no right to let a clause erase other people's lives. The elevator hesitated at the 27th floor. The assistant who checked guests did not ask questions when a girl in a uniform followed an events coordinator through the door. She had practiced the gait, a borrowed badge tucked into her pocket like a composure lesson. Inside, she set the photocopy on the table beside glasses of water and hors d'oeuvres. She did not plan the protest of interrupting a signing. She planned to speak to someone who could read the words and care. When the moment came, Jackson's hand mid-air, the pen above the line, her body found the pitch that would be heard. The security guard called her girl. The PR director called her attention seeker. The board called the meeting into recess. Someone in the back muttered legalese as if that could drown out a paper's plain sentence. Clara's face did something like a mask slipping. "Show me," Jackson said finally. His voice was not unkind. It held the weariness of someone used to being the only one who held the room. She slid the photocopy across the table. Hands hovered over it with gloves of entitlement. For a moment it belonged to everyone and no one. The clause was small and efficient. It did not shout. It did not explain itself. It folded the aftermath onto Hale Investments in conditions anyone not trained to look would miss. "You're sure?" asked a board member. The question was less about the clause than about whether the world had the stomach to be corrected by a 16-year-old with a mop job. Maya was tired in the way of someone who carried a tool that cut against her rightful rest. She was precise. "Yes, it transfers obligations the other company is shedding. If signed, this company takes on claims that should remain with them. It flips the liability." The board heard the word liability and moved like actors hitting a cue. Someone reached for a lawyer. Phones found their apps. Security approached with the kind of decisiveness the law reserves for trespassers and small things it needs to push out of its way. They escorted her through a door that had felt like a hole in the world. Cameras blinked. The corridor smelled of new leather and antiseptic. Someone taped over the pages on the table with a post-it note. "Reconcile before signing." The pen's shadow finally crossed the page and settled. They had not yet signed, but they would decide to postpone. They put her on forced leave. The company's HR office said politely that she had breached protocol. The official paperwork said nothing about the clause she'd pointed to. That afternoon at home, Maya's phone vibrated. A number she did not recognize sent a message. "I saw what happened. Don't go back to school tomorrow. Meet me at the old cafe on 3rd at 7. Her chest went tight. The message read like a lifeline. She told Denise. They both looked at the photocopy spread on the kitchen table, the inked letters now afternoon-worn, like a map that had been read too many times. Denise tapped a finger on the phrase, "legacy liabilities," and asked quietly, "Who is going to believe a kid?" Maya looked at her mother like someone who had already answered. "You don't have to believe me," she said, "but I have to say it." After the boardroom, the news inside Hale Investments circulated like heat off asphalt. A rumor of a merger suspension made it to the morning traders. Someone inside the legal department whispered that a rival firm had warned of third-party claims. The PR team drafted statements about internal processes and ensuring due diligence. An assistant quietly archived an email trail. Derek Vaughan watched the noise and flinched as if a heat he could smell was starting to scorch his fingertips. He had been in the business long enough to understand where a flipped liability could be weaponized. Purchase a failing company, contractually move its debts to the buyer, and leave the shell company clean. It was clever, legal adjacent, and tasteless in the way of the very rich. Derek had a partner in coordination, Clara. He admired her skill with numbers the way other men admired sculptures. Where he liked to move markets, she liked to move numbers quietly. The two of them had designed a mechanism that made corporate exits look tidy in press releases and brutal in practice. Clara called a meeting with her counsel. She counted on patterns, how people reacted when surprised, how they minimized the words of the outraged when it came from the uninvited. She was fond of order. If order had a face, Clara's was composed and dispassionate, a face that could perform compassion at a distance. In the weeks that followed, the company treated the event like a minor spill. Maya's badge was deactivated pending investigation. Her schedule was cleared. She could walk the halls, but not the rooms that made the building hum. Colleagues who had once nodded politely in her direction now crossed the floor to avoid eye contact. The building's veins tightened at her passing. At home, the photocopy was a visitor between the cereal boxes and the bills. She took it to school in case someone would listen there. Teenagers could be cynical, but sometimes they were more honest about what they saw than adults who had something to protect. The anonymous message at 7 p.m. turned out to be from a man who had worked in Hale Investments' mergers department 10 years earlier, Robert Barnes. He'd been a quiet presence in the office, patient, 2 cups of coffee, a habit of tinkering with spreadsheets late into the night. He'd left under an odd press of circumstance. People said layoffs. A few said he'd been let go for cause. He was the kind of person who stored records in a way that made them breathe. Barnes slid into the booth at the old cafe, bringing with him the coffee-scented hush of someone who had seen deals break in ways that looked like accidents. "You're the janitor's daughter," he said, like a question answered. Maya told him, as if names had anchors no paperwork could hold. He listened to the story she told in halting sentences. The photocopy, the boardroom, the forced leave. He did not look surprised. He had eyes that catalogued what most people considered background details. "I saw this before," Barnes said. He tapped his fingers on the table, made small maps in the foam of his coffee. "Vaughan runs a template. You swap one sentence, and you move a liability that would cost millions onto the buyer. They do it using shell companies and promises no one reads." He slid a USB drive across the table. No flashy branding, no clues. "I kept copies," he said. "Old cases, contracts, transfers. If what you say is right, this is a pattern." Maya felt weight move in her chest. Proof lived in small things, the way a clause was worded, an approval email missing one key phrase, a transfer to a holding company that had less of a history than a post office box. "Why did you leave?" she asked. Barnes' laugh was brittle. "Because I argued once. Because I sent an email that said, 'This is dangerous.' They closed ranks. They made me leave. I kept copies, the way someone keeps a ribbon. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe that one day someone had to see it." He warned her quietly. "You don't want them mad at you." They arranged to meet again. He said he would give her accounts and transfers that showed a trail to an entity called Raven Cross Holdings, a name that meant nothing until it did. He implied offshore accounts, intermediary transfers, approval signatures with timestamps that could be forged, but also verified. Barnes was precise about the steps a legal team would want: chain of custody, timestamp verification, independent audits. He said the name of an old friend who did digital forensics for free sometimes. He gave Maya the smallest picture of how to make a quiet thing loud. On the way home, Maya cradled the USB drive as if it were a tiny heart. She put it in a drawer between past due notices and an old calculator. She felt danger then, like a weight at the edges of a shadow. Not dramatic, but persistent. There were other signs. Her locker at school was vandalized with a smear of cheap paint. Someone left a threatening note tucked beneath the doormat of her family's apartment. "Watch what you wish for." Her mother shrank tighter into routines that made her safer, remembering where the extra set of keys was hidden, locking the back door twice. The company's PR machine spun a story about internal procedural review and anomalous access. A press release called it an unfortunate interruption. A reporter phoned, not with curiosity but with hunger. Did a teenage girl derail a multinational deal? The headline writers smelled drama. The legal team smelled liability. Maya felt the world thin to the size of a photocopy. She slept badly. She read the clause again and again. Paper is patient but persistent. The words did not change. Meanwhile, officers she'd only known as distant employees began to feel different. Jackson paced in his private study, a glass overspilling with the last of his evening whiskey. He had been raised to believe that deals made progress, and reputation was a currency that, once spent, could be borrowed against to clean mistakes. Clara called him in the dark, small hours and measured her words. "We need to neutralize this," she said. "We can't let a stray complaint delay the closing. There's too much at stake." There were other conversations in other rooms, where Derek Vaughan listened to his counsel advise that the right PR phrasing and a friendly regulatory review could make a problem evaporate. He counted on other people's distrust of the messy unknown. People generally wanted to believe their leaders. People wanted the discomfort to go away. That was the environment in which Maya operated, a culture of smoothing edges, where her kind of discomfort was treated as a pebble in a shoe someone else would remove. She had no title, and in most people's eyes, no standing. But she had the photocopy. Barnes kept contacting her. He sent an encrypted email with passwords and folders. The files read like a map: ledger lines, transfers, timestamps. There were references to offshore companies that had names better suited for novels than balance sheets. Raven Cross Holdings, it turned out, had been used before in a similar deal a county over. The same clause, same outcome. The acquiring company was left with the legal hangover. When Maya showed the files to Denise, her mother's hands shook for the first time in a way that had nothing to do with age. "We need a lawyer," Denise said. Maya felt a strange inflation of responsibility. She had not been seeking the law. She had been seeking truth, but the two had started to look like the same thing. They did not yet know that someone was looking back. Late on a rain-slick Friday, Maya found an email with a voice clipped from the older man's manner. It read, "Meet me at the old dock tomorrow. I have to go quiet. Bring someone who can verify." The message grew colder. "Watch the news tomorrow morning." she told Denise. They considered calling the police. Maya wanted to believe in the professionalism of law enforcement. She wanted also to avoid a narrative where someone else decided for them. They arranged to go to the meeting with a friend who knew digital forensics, a young man with a steady job in IT who owed Barnes a favor years ago. The next morning, the city's news played a background of stock tickers and analysts. Hale Investments had put the merger on hold pending review. Headlines were careful. The company's legal team had issued a statement saying it took all concerns seriously, and that independent counsel was being retained. The phrase independent was a comfort word. It suggested distance between the company and the issue. For those who read the clause, comfort was small. Barnes did not show up at the dock. His car was in its spot at the lot. His apartment door was unlocked. His keys were inside. A neighbor said he left his apartment late, as if to a walk no one promised he'd return from. His apartment computer was open to a spreadsheet. The last item on the screen was a list of account transfers. Someone had taken Barnes out of the equation like a punctuation removed from a sentence. The news that day did not say missing. It said Barnes unresponsive, under investigation. For a few hours it sounded like a bureaucratic lullaby. For Maya it sounded like an erasing. Her phone lit up with one more message from the number that had connected them. Don't meet anyone alone. Go to someone you trust. He had expected threats. He had expected them to arrive before the facts could. The message ended with a single line she could not pass at first. If they bury him, find the backups. Maya sat at their kitchen table and stared at the photocopy until the letters blurred. The clause, the boardroom, the pen, all of it reassembled into a geometry of risk she could no longer ignore. She felt small, yes, but she did not feel alone. There were things that gave off a light when exposed to scrutiny, an account number, an offhand email, a timestamp. The arc of the story, she knew, would not be decided at a copier or in a hallway. It would be decided by people who could look at a chain of custody and say the word authentic without blinking. It would be decided by counsel who could take a clause and translate it into human impact. She did not have counsel. She had a photocopy and a USB drive and a neighbor with an IT job. She had a mother who would fight for her like a small, bright animal. But she needed more. People like Barnes did not disappear quietly from the ledger. People like Jackson Hale did not always change course without a reason. The company had resources, and so did the people working against that company's inner mechanics. There were layers to deception. Paperwork, shell entities, PR, and the cultivation of plausible deniability. Maya thought of the phrase her grandfather used to say, "Read the sentence. It will tell you who hurt you." She typed an email that felt extravagant in its formality and sent it to a woman she had seen on TV once, Victoria Chan. Victoria was a former prosecutor who had built a reputation for taking on cases where the powerful made laws into instruments for the few. In the broadcast clip, Victoria's jaw carried a justice that was procedural and fierce. Maya's fingers hovered before she hit send. The email was simple. "My name is Maya Williams. I have documents. I was on the 27th floor. Please advise." Why Victoria? Maya thought of the way prosecutors used words to make the invisible visible. She wanted someone who could say, in a court of law, that a sentence on a page could not be washed out by a good PR team. Victoria read the message on a plane ride between cases. She set it aside like a hot coal and then called the number the way someone who wanted to be precise made calls, with an appointment and an agenda. The truth has a smell. A person who trains to seek it follows the scent of documents and discrepancies. When Victoria called, she asked for the photocopy. She asked where Maya had found it. She didn't laugh. She didn't ask if Maya was sure. She said, "We'll be careful. Don't talk to anyone else." Maya felt relief like rain. But relief is not a shield, it is a temporary shelter. The world outside was already arranging itself. There were quiet attempts to discredit the messenger, a blogger who wrote about an opportunistic youth, an online commenter who questioned the motives of someone with no corporate credentials, and an anonymous op-ed that suggested the company had been the target of an elaborate hoax. Someone in marketing, Clara's ally, hinted that there were irregularities in Maya's background. They called her mother to ask questions, a courtesy call that felt like a probe. The pressure was not just legal, it was social. It was the kind that rusted small reputations slowly and efficiently. Wednesday night, a single envelope arrived at the Williams apartment. It was thin. Inside, a printout of a transfer, Raven Cross Holdings, to an account in a name that matched a trustee connected to Clara Hale. The printout had been made from a printer that left little dust prints. It had been made by someone who wanted to scare and then stop. Denise folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket. "We could go to the police," she said again, and the repetition felt like a brick thrown at a wall. Maya shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "We need lawyers." The message from Barnes came the next day. It was short, like a man trying to keep himself organized. "If they're watching, be careful. There's a backup server for the old files. I'll send credentials tonight." He never sent the credentials. At a gala dinner, that was, by all accounts, an extravagant attempt to reassure investors, Jackson stood on a stage and said the kind of things CEOs say when they want to be believed. "We are committed to transparency. We will cooperate with any legitimate inquiry." The cameras caught a sliver of genuine discomfort in the words. He was not a man born to casual moral epiphanies. This one had been thrust at him like a cold towel. He had seen the clause. He had felt the pen hover. He had asked his legal team to look into it. He did not yet know how deep the thing ran, how many signatures had been faked, or how many people had been trained to look away. He also did not know how many people he loved were implicated. Clara's name was on approvals. Clara's signature was a stamp in the system that could be explained away as administrative haste. She would say she was doing what a partner asked. She would say she had signed what she saw. She had not intended harm. Inside the gala, Clara moved through rooms with a smile that practiced light. Derek Vaughan sat nearby and sipped the same whiskey as Jackson, the two of them a tableau of ease. Clara had always been good at managing the impression of calm. Derek had always been good at moving money like furniture. When Maya watched the footage of Jackson's staged transparency on the evening news, the camera caught a moment Jackson could not hide. His hand lingered over a program page the way someone touches a ledger. His eyes were somewhere else. He must have been thinking of the boardroom and the pen and that small voice that had spoken like fact. He would act. He would later tell himself that he had acted because of proof, not because of guilt. That was the legal tone of self-preservation, and in corporate life, tones mattered as much as facts. For now, Maya waited. She kept the photocopy like a talisman. She kept Barnes's USB in the drawer. She put her sneakers on and took long walks to clear the way the night cleaning had taught her, finding paths where doors opened quietly, where what needed to be seen could be seen. The first legal motion would not happen overnight. Whistleblower protections existed on paper and required petitions, counsel, filings that had to be methodical. Victoria would not walk into this as a crusade. She would start by verifying the chain of custody, by confirming that the documents had not been manufactured. She would begin the slow work of making paper speak in court. Barnes's abrupt absence changed the energy. It made the pattern smell more like a plan. Maya found herself looking over her shoulder, not because she was afraid of physical harm, but because she understood the kind of power that preferred problems to be solved by erasing people from stories. A few days later, the first anonymous smear appeared online. A local blog claimed Maya had fabricated the photocopy. The comment threads filled with people ready to believe explanations that kept the world orderly. It is easier to blame the messenger than examine the sentence. Maya watched the comments and thought about the boardroom's silence. She thought about the way someone's hand can hover over a pen for seconds that feel like winters. She thought about her mother's ways of keeping a home heartier than their accounts suggested. Then, a late-night call came from a number that had never rung before. A voice, not quite Barnes's but close enough to carry a memory of him, said only one sentence. "Don't go to school tomorrow. They've started looking through cameras." Maya closed her eyes and felt the world tilt. She told Denise. They decided to take their social breaths in a circle. Neighbors who believed them. An old pastor who had once vouched for Denise's trustworthiness. A friend of Denise's who worked with a state rep and could point them to someone who helped with emergency protective steps. They moved quietly, like people trying not to wake a sleeping house of cards. But cards and markets both had momentum. The claws had already prickled the market. Hale Investment stock experienced a slight but noticeable wobble. Nothing catastrophic, yet tangible enough to move people's attention. Analysts asked questions about due diligence and post-merger risk. Merger counters filed queries. In the quiet between those ripples, a different sound grew. A whisper that Maya was now untouchable, only in the court of public opinion, if she could reach a jury. The legal path was narrow and slow. It required a person who could speak and be heard without being drowned by PR. Victoria called finally to say she would take the case. She did so not out of sentiment, but because the file had the shape of something prosecutable, a pattern across deals, corresponding transfers, signatures that could be cross-checked. "We will protect you," she said, and the phrase meant more than safety. It meant standing in a system that worked by documented truth and witnesses under oath. Maya felt a strange elation. It was not the kind that comes with victory. It was the kind that comes with a plan. That night, she dreamed of a pen suspended above a page, and she woke with the feeling that whatever she had started could not be unsaid. She had spoken. The world had reacted. Far from the Williams apartment, in a conference room that smelled of polished wood and expensive cologne, Jackson Hale sat with his counsel. He listened as investigators explained the mechanics, shell entities, intermediary transfers, sign-off anomalies, an approval trail that pointed to Ravencross Holdings, and a chain that had Clara's signature nestled under an administrative timestamp that did not line up with her calendar. He felt the room tilt. He thought about the pen he had not used and the face of the girl who had spoken. He had a history of thinking in dollars and processes. Now his mind worked in words. There was a quiet ache with conscience, less sudden redemption than an accumulation of discomfort he could no longer ignore. He called Clara in to ask questions she could not manage with deniability. She began with calm and moved to a measure of panic that was controlled because she knew how to manage panic in public. She said she had signed in haste. She said the transactional nature of their work required trust. She suggested the possibility of human error. Her answers were tidy. Her eyes, however, moved like someone who had been caught in a ledger she had underestimated. Derek Vaughan, facing the same files across his own desk, started to measure fallout. He began to whisper to counsel about contingency plans, about safe storage of funds, about moving assets to trustees. He thought of media strategies and lawsuits. He had a map of exits ready if he needed them. The world they all inhabited was one where sentences on papers could be engineered into weapons. The grammar of those sentences could be designed to slice liability like wire cutters. Someone wrote the clause to be missed, to be passed over by eyes trained to expect standard language. That kind of craft is not accidental, it is disciplined. And now that it had been named, it presented a possibility: exposure. The risk to them was not only legal, it was reputational, financial, and human. They moved to contain it. Maya moved to document everything. She made a copy of the USB and put it on a drive she entrusted to a neighbor who had once worked in a law office. She backed up the photocopy in a bank safe deposit. She slept with the television on and the volume low, a background noise that made the night less absolute. The city, meanwhile, rearranged itself into two kinds of people, those who could be bought off by silence and those who could not. Maya had always been in the latter group by default. There was little that silenced her curiosity. She knew now there would be cost. On a rainy Wednesday, a camera in a public space captured a man in a grey hoodie following Barnes into a convenience store. The footage was grainy, the face unidentifiable. It did not suggest a courtroom drama so much as the kind of small, mean acts that paved the way for larger felonies. People in suits called it circumstantial. People on the street called it ominous. Maya, waiting in her kitchen for an answer from Victoria about next steps, felt the weight of the next chapter like a presence at her shoulder. She thought of the boardroom. The pen paused, the room silent, and understood that a single remark had indeed changed the flow of many lives. She understood the title of the moment without thinking of headlines. This remark changed everything. She whispered the sentence she had once said aloud, the one that had pierced a table of executives and bloodless policy. It flips the liability. The words were small and powerful. They were not the end. They were a beginning. And somewhere, in a small office that smelled of burnt coffee and litigation, a woman named Victoria leaned forward and tapped a finger against a legal pad. She had a file and a plan. She knew the shape of the work ahead: petitions, protective orders, forensic audits, witness interviews. It would move slowly and thoroughly. It would require patience and courage. On the Williams' kitchen table, Denise folded the photocopy and placed it back under a cookbook. They both understood it might be the most dangerous thing they owned, and the most necessary. Outside, the city carried on, indifferent and shimmering. Inside their apartment, a young woman who had never asked to be the center of anything listened to the rain on the windows and thought about the way words could expose a truth that power wanted to bury. She thought about Barnes and his missing files. She thought about a CEO's paused pen. She thought about the moral cost of silence. A knock came at the door that night. Maya opened it to a young man with an empty look and a hoodie, who introduced himself as someone who could verify digital timestamps if she gave him a drive. She thought about the risk. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about the sentence on the photocopy. She thought about what it might mean to let a lie continue because confronting it was dangerous. Maya stepped aside and said, "Come in." The young man with the hoodie set his bag on the kitchen table like a proposition. He introduced himself as Andre Rivera, but he spoke less like an introduction than a list of credentials. A friend of Barnes, freelance forensic tech, knows how to trace metadata. He did not swagger. He had hands that refused to tremble. Maya slid the USB drive across the laminate. Andre plugged it into a laptop that had stickers from open-source projects and an older operating system that had seen better days. He clicked and watched the cursor rename files. He moved through directories with the steady patience of someone passing many years of quiet deceit. "You kept copies," he said without looking up. "Good. Whoever took Barnes out of the picture missed the redundancy." The files breathed on the screen. There were approval timestamps, emails, PDFs with embedded properties. There were hashes, digital fingerprints that, when compared, showed discrepancies. Andre pointed to a line in a PDF's metadata that betrayed a timestamp inconsistent with the server's log. He showed a trail of transfers that moved through a web of trusts and beneficiaries. Ravencross Holdings blinked up like an echo. Maya watched like someone learning a language in which the words were numbers. Every anomaly Andre showed fit the pattern Barnes had described. When Andre zoomed into an approval signature, Maya saw the tiny pixelation that suggested a pasted image rather than a genuine biometric token. "You can show this in court?" she asked. Andre looked at her directly. "If we preserve chain of custody, if we document how we accessed and verified, yes. But we can't rush. Evidence breaks if you bang it." Victoria's office became a small command center. She moved with the calibrated energy of someone who had seen case files overflow, not because the facts were missing, but because the powerful resisted clarity. She filed a petition for whistleblower protection, demanded a forensic audit, and asked for an immediate injunction to freeze certain transfers. Words that sounded like bureaucracy on their face were scaffolding in practice. She also called federal investigators with the crispness of someone used to precise speech. "We don't go loud prematurely," she told Maya at their first meeting. "We build a record. We get protective orders. We get the things that mean the evidence can't be erased." Maya felt, in that room, both smaller and larger than she had ever been. It was startling to be the center of a legal orbit. People asked for her recollection again and again, but each retelling tightened the case rather than frayed it. She learned to describe the clause with exactness, to point to the sentence that had made a pen pause. Her voice grew steadier with each practiced line. Jackson had a different arc. At first, he had treated the interruption as a bureaucratic, if humiliating, mistake. He had a ledger of rationalizations, and he had teams to sort them. Seeing the documents was the thing that shifted him. Not a movie of moral reckoning, but a slow unspooling as auditors brought forward inconsistencies. The internal audit flagged approvals with timestamps that did not fit Clara's calendar. Wire transfers that skirted standard channels and funneled through nominees with ties to Derek Vaughan. His first instinct was to shield the enterprise. His second was to know what the truth required. That tug between preservation and rectitude made him restless. He called Victoria when he had facts he could not ignore and asked how to cooperate without looking performative. "You help us find a way to make this right," he said. The sentence was uneven. It sounded like someone who had been given a new vocabulary and was learning to use it. Victoria listened. "You'll have to be transparent. You will have to accept oversight. You will need to accept that actions have consequences." He accepted. Not perfectly. He did not and would not erase the fact that his first reaction had been to measure risk. But he moved beyond that. He authorized an independent forensic team. He opened internal logs to investigators. He sat asleep at odd hours, reading reports in the glow of a screen that had once shown only spreadsheets and headlines. Clara's defenses, meanwhile, shored up. She was smart in the way people who have made careers out of managing perception learn to be. She understood that truth could be slowed by stories. She handled press statements, handed prepared quotes to allies, and sought to displace suspicion with narratives that emphasized complexity and human error. Derek moved more aggressively. He urged legal counters, litigation threats, defamation preemptions, hints of suits against whistleblowers. They prepared a dossier of their own, full of alternative explanations. They also used the old levers, PR narratives and targeted leaks. An op-ed ran under a pseudonym that suggested guild-like complicity. A young intern had fabricated a story. A local blogger posted an anonymous tip alleging Maya had planted the photocopy. The campaign was not loud. It smelled of smoke meant to confuse the air. It used plausible doubts to shift attention. At school, the smear reached beyond screens into hallways. The graffiti on Maya's locker grew bolder. Someone posted doctored images, tagged with comments that questioned whether Maya had connections to Barnes. The harassment was the small communal kind that spreads fastest: ridicule, social ostracism, whispered jokes in stairwells. Maya learned to let it wash over her without retreating. Victoria anticipated attacks on credibility. She prepared Maya the way a teacher prepares a student for an oral exam: how to answer plainly, how to refuse to be baited, how to anchor testimony in verifiable facts rather than feelings. She sat with Maya and quizzed her about dates, about where she had found files, about what she had heard in the boardroom. "You won't be the only witness," Victoria said, "but you will be the first. Don't let them make you apologize for seeing what others chose not to." The first subpoena arrived like a small official guillotine, a command to testify in a preliminary investigative hearing. The room in the courthouse smelled of wax and bureaucracy. Journalists crowded in, waiting for a soundbite. Derek's counsel, quick and polished, tried to build a theory of mischief, a kid with access, a copyist at heart. The press, hungry for drama, made a spectacle of the fact she was young. Maya sat, hands folded, and said what she had said before, only quieter. She told the hearing how she had found the page in the copier, how she had photocopied it, and the exact words that had made her think it was a trap. She described the boardroom, the pen, and the silence. Nothing theatrical, just the sequence of facts. There were small victories in that session. An examiner called Andre to the stand to explain metadata. Andre explained, simple, non-technical language, that a file's metadata is like a receipt. It records where a file has been and how it was altered. He spoke about hashes and timestamps and how one could compare server logs to an embedded timestamp to expose manipulation. Standing in the hallway after the hearing, Andre told Maya they had a good paper trail and that prosecutors were paying attention. The words felt unreal, the way a small town became a map in someone else's hands. Barnes remained missing. His absence haunted the case. It was a gap, an insult, a risk, yet his backups were not completely gone. He had trusted people in the margins, old colleagues, a digital friend who kept copies in obscure, redundant places. The pattern of transfers, revealed by his files, pointed to a trustee account in a jurisdiction that required cooperation for discovery. It would take motion practice and time, but the path existed. The boardroom remained an emotional gash in Jackson's life. He found himself haunted by the memory of a young voice, and privately by the realization that he had been both the beneficiary and the blind. He began to make public gestures, announcements of audits, of compliance overhauls, not because they would fix everything, but because procedure mattered. He attended Victoria's early meetings. He sat through forensic briefings, and when handed evidence that tied to Clara, he did not look away. That was the moment his marriage began to crumble, not in an explosive, movie-style breakup, but in the quiet fissures of trust. Clara became defensive. Her answers hardened. Where she once explained numbers as if they were instruments of stewardship, she now explained them as if they were devices under siege. Under oath in a deposition, she described timelines and approvals the way a person describes steps in a recipe. Yet her voice faltered when auditors demonstrated that an approval had been done at a time she had been demonstrably off-site. Derek, watching the cracks form, moved to protect what he could. He called in favors, approached trustees discreetly, and began to set up legal bulwarks. He hired counsel who specialized in fading fingerprints, lawyers who knew how to turn forensic certainty into reasonable doubt. The prosecution strategy, led by a special counsel who had taken interest after Victoria's filings, was methodical. Build a pattern across deals, show replication of the clause, tie transfers to Ravencross Holdings, show the unusual signing protocols, and connect the dots through communications and money flow. They lined up witnesses who could speak to the template Derek used, bankruptcies that followed similar clauses, statements from entrepreneurs whose companies later collapsed under inherited claims. The media circled. Some outlets sympathized with the company's instability argument. Others began to amplify the narrative of corporate malfeasance. The public appetite for narrative masked a harder truth. Legal truth grows like coral, layered and patient. At school, a teacher who had once noticed Maya staying late to help a classmate with homework sent a letter to Victoria's office vouching for her steadiness. Neighbors brought casseroles. A local activist group rallied quietly, offering to accompany Maya to hearings. Support appeared in small human forms that were not newsworthy but mattered. Pretrial motions tightened the timeline. Victoria obtained protective orders for Maya and her family, got the court to recognize the chain of custody for Barnes's files, and secured a subpoena to unseal certain trustee records. Federal agents began to ask their own questions about international transfers. It was not instantaneous. No one in the case expected instant justice, but the machinery of oversight creaked into motion. The trial began in late autumn. The courtroom was an arena not of gladiators, but of procedure. There were jurors called from the city, ordinary people asked to weigh evidence. The opening statements painted two models of the world, one where smart people exploited language to shift harm, and another where a small error had been misinterpreted by an opportunistic outsider. Victoria's opening was quiet and precise. She framed the case as one about engineered displacement of responsibility. This, she told the jury, is not about the morality of mergers. It's about a clause designed to make sure that no one sees the damage until it's too late. Derek's counsel painted a different image, a negotiation beset by typical complexities, a company that had acted in good faith, an unfortunate misunderstanding amplified by a young witness. The contrast was deliberate. The jurors would choose which version of reality to adopt. Maya sat in a witness room before taking the stand and felt the weight of being both evidence and person. Victoria told her to breathe. "Tell the truth," she said. "No flourish. We don't need it." When Maya took the stand, she did not speak like a prepared actor. She spoke like someone who had watched a pattern and named it. She explained how she found the clause, how she had felt it to be a trap, and why she had gone into the boardroom. She said things that were small and exact: the copier model, the page number, the phrase legacy liabilities, and the context in which it appeared. At a critical moment in her testimony, she looked up at the board members and said, not theatrically, but plain and clear, "I'm the one who cleans your floors. That doesn't mean I don't see the mess you leave behind." The line landed like a bell. It was not a dramatic plea. It was a truth about perspective. Derek's counsel attacked credibility. He suggested that Maya had motive, attention, notoriety. He asked about her relationship with Barnes. He asked whether she had altered files. Victoria objected when the questions drifted into innuendo, and the judge cut through repetition with a reminder about relevance. Andre testified about the metadata. He explained in simple terms what digital traces meant and why certain timestamps could not have been honest. A forensic accountant walked through the transfer path. Small sums moved through nominees, then aggregated and sent to accounts linked to Ravencross Holdings, then moved onward to a trust that benefited a small group of anonymous entities. The trail was not single-point dramatic. It was mundane and therefore damning. Ledgers, wires, confirmations. Clara testified, initially calm, about her role in approvals. Her answers were the kind that, when filmed, felt rehearsed. Under cross-examination, counsel introduced an email thread where she had asked for expedited sign-off. She claimed administrative pressure. The judge allowed the jury to see the timestamp next to the approval. The pivotal blow came when an auditor showed a chain of approvals and highlighted a pattern. The clause appeared in multiple deals with identical language and similar routing. Only this time, the other party included an addendum that seemed to absolve them of legacy claims, but the addendum was paired with a rollback clause that primed Hale Investments to accept the burden if certain triggers occurred. The auditor's analysis made something that felt like accounting arcana into something anyone could understand, an engineered handoff of pain. The defense tried to argue that the clause was standard and that the company's internal procedures would have caught any harm. But the thing that made jurors sit up was not just the clause itself, but the evidence linking payments and approvals to actors who benefited financially when the clause bit. During a mid-trial recess, Jackson was called to testify. He walked in with the fatigue of a man who had learned that oversight can be both light and heavy. On the stand, he did not perform. He answered about the process, about what he had seen, and about the moments he had been asked to trust others. He admitted he had been the kind of executive who delegated vigilance. He did not apologize theatrically. He spoke in straightforward sentences, what he knew, what he wished he had known sooner, and the steps he had taken once he saw the pattern. That honesty cost him some public affection, but improved his credibility in the courtroom. He acknowledged Clara's role without setting out to crucify her. Instead, he described being misled and failing to notice early warning signs in time. His testimony pushed the narrative into a technical moral zone. Leaders are responsible for systems even when they did not author each clause. Clara's composure broke on cross-examination when presented with evidence of transfers routed through intermediaries, whose ultimate beneficiary matched a trustee with links to her charity accounts. She looked away. The defense's attempt to pass coincidence failed to hold. The jurors watched as a carefully constructed account of events became a story of choices. Outside the courtroom, Derek tried to buy leverage, other trustees, offshore shelters, but the judicial net tightened slowly and methodically. Federal investigators took interest when they saw the pattern of transfers crossing borders and the involvement of shell structures. International cooperation is not instant, but it matters. The jury deliberated. It was not a quick process. Jurors wrestled with technical exhibits and human testimony. They had to decide whether the clause was a sinister instrument designed to offload liabilities and whether Clara and Derek had knowingly participated. When they returned, the room held its breath. Guilty on multiple counts. The words hit like rain. Derek's face tightened. Clara lowered her head and did not look at Jackson. The verdict was not the end. There were sentencing phases and appeals and civil actions that would take years. But the criminal conviction carried a moral weight. The law had recognized the scheme's intentionality. After the verdict, reforms followed. Jackson did not escape scrutiny. Public anger demanded change. He worked with Victoria and independent monitors to overhaul Hale Investments' approvals process. They instituted mandatory dual authentication for critical clauses, independent reviewers for mergers involving contingent liabilities, and whistleblower protections with confidentiality and channels for anonymous reporting. He set up a compliance board with independent directors and funded an internal audit team free from executive control. He did not do it purely for reputation. He believed, slowly and imperfectly, that systems mattered. He also established a fellowship, an endowed program to support young people from working-class backgrounds seeking education in law and corporate governance. He put his name on the paperwork because that was visibility, and because Victoria argued it would be useful to have a visible commitment. Maya's name was attached to the first fellowship in a way that turned a phrase into policy, the Williams Fellowship for Corporate Transparency. It offered tuition and mentorship for people wanting to learn to read the language powerful institutions sometimes use to hide harm. Clara faced sentencing, and in the months that followed, a conviction for conspiracy and a role in the scheme. Her punishment reflected culpability. Derek's sentence was longer. Both lost liberty and standing. There were civil suits for restitution and a period where Hale Investments paid settlements to companies that had been wronged by the broader scheme. Those civil resolutions are never full compensation. They are workarounds to a kind of damage, but they mattered in concrete ways. Small businesses that had been swallowed by legal hangovers got some relief. Barnes's absence remained an ache. Months later, a federal task force found him alive, hidden by someone who had feared for his safety and had set up a plan to move him for his protection. He had been frightened but unharmed physically. He had, it turned out, taken steps to avoid being a target. He resurfaced to testify. His decision to keep copies and to entrust backups to people who would not forget saved crucial pieces of the case. He did not return to the company. He became a quiet figure at hearings, an expert witness whose testimony about past deals helped establish Derek's pattern. Maya's life shifted in tangible ways. The scholarship covered tuition at a university she had only dreamed of attending. The fellowship connected her with mentors who taught her about contract law and corporate ethics. She began studying political science and accounting in evening classes. She kept cleaning shifts at first, work that meant more than income, but the schedule loosened as support systems moved into place. Neighbors helped with rides, donors set up funds for incidental costs. The community that had once been invisible behind her work now cheered the small, balanced victories. She did not, however, become a symbol. Not exactly. People called her the janitor's daughter in loose quotes and news segments, but she refused to be reduced. She spoke in public about the case with measured words, emphasizing systems and policies rather than personal glory. She urged reform at corporate and legal levels, not revenge. Jackson's transformation continued to be uneven. He had moments where defensiveness rose, but increasingly it was replaced by a practical desire to change the company so that other people did not get hurt in future deals. He testified before regulators about compliance and took responsibility publicly. He pledged funds to monitor enforcement and hired a director of ethical transactions, someone whose job was, bluntly, to read every final draft with a skeptical eye. The city watched, and the tabloids did their work of turning complexity into drama. But the real work was quieter: audits, checks, a new culture where clauses were read aloud in meetings instead of buried under appendices. The change did not happen overnight, and cynics would always point to empty promises. Yet there were metrics: fewer contested post-merger liabilities in the company's pipeline, increased whistleblower reports handled confidentially, and a compliance team whose independence was tested and sustained. Maya's relationship with Denise deepened under the strain and the healing. Denise, who had learned caution as survival, became an advocate in her own right, volunteering at community centers to teach document literacy to other workers. Their lives were not made perfect by the verdict. There were bills and lingering suspicion, and people who would forever see Maya through the lens of the courtroom. But there was also dignity restored in ways that mattered, a scholarship that meant opportunity, safety measures that allowed her to sleep without the constant worry of being surveilled, and a community that acknowledged her courage. The final image of the public arc was not a single moment, but a series of small, solid scenes. A compliance officer circling a clause and sending an email that required 2 independent sign-offs. A university ceremony where Maya, in modest robes, accepted an award that read, in small letters, "For courage in pursuit of truth." Jackson signing the incorporation papers for a transparency fellowship and handing a check to Victoria. There were private reckonings, too. Clara wrote letters of regret from prison, offering the kind of explanations that could not undo harm, but did give some insight into the mechanisms of rationalization. Derek, in interviews after release, argued that business sometimes required hard choices. People disagreed with that view, even as they studied it for lessons about how power can justify itself. For Maya, the cost was never merely legal. She had friendships strained by public attention and lost the simplicity of anonymity. She had to relearn trust. She learned to accept support without feeling like a charity case. She learned also to direct her anger into systems work, helping other communities understand how to read terms and how to push corporate entities toward accountability. Years later, she walked into the new building that housed the fellowship program, named in part after her. The plaque at the reception bore names, donors, mentors, and a small inscription that read, in plain language, "For those who read the sentence." She touched the edge of the plaque like someone saying amen. Jackson retired from his executive role with an apology that was complicated and real. He attended a community forum where he answered tough questions from people whose lives had been affected by corporate deals. He spoke in sentences that showed someone who had learned to accept accountability. "We were wrong. We will do better." A small legal reform followed. The state adopted stricter standards for transferring contingent liabilities in mergers, inspired in part by the public attention the case had generated. The law required clearer disclosures and mandatory audits when certain phrases like legacy liabilities appeared in agreements. It was not a cure-all. It was a tool. In a modest ceremony, Maya accepted the first Williams Fellowship recipient, a young woman from a working-class neighborhood with a steady laugh and a love of reading contracts for the way other people might read poems. Maya spoke briefly. She did not grandstand. She said one thing that caught. "Pay attention to the sentence. It will tell you where the harm lives." The phrase landed in the room the way an old map fits into a hand. The years changed people slowly. Maya completed her degree part-time and later took a job in an organization focused on corporate accountability. She continued to clean sometimes, not out of necessity, but because the work had taught her discipline and because she liked to remember where courage had begun. The city moved on, as cities do. Hale Investments remained a company with a new compliance regime and new leadership that tried to balance profit with transparency. Derek's name faded in headlines. Clara's became a footnote in a larger story about systems and individual choice. The lasting lesson, anchored in the memory of a pen hovering and a room growing silent, was not simply that a girl had stopped a deal. It was that a voice from the margins had the power to force institutions to examine how they assigned risk. It was that words on a page could be engineered to hide consequences, and that the opposite was also true. Words could unmask those consequences. On a cool spring morning, Maya stood at a podium in a small auditorium filled with students and community members. She spoke not as a heroine, but as someone who had been part of a process that had consequences. She told them how she had found the clause, how a photocopy had changed many lives, and how courage often looks like a patient insistence on truth. After she spoke, students crowded to ask questions. One young man asked, "What would you tell someone who finds something like that, but is scared?" Maya thought of the nights of fear, of Barnes's absence, of Andre's steady hands, of Victoria's precise plans. She thought of Dennis's quiet strength. She said simply, "Find someone who will document it with you. Keep the evidence safe. Don't let them gaslight you into silence. And remember this, just because the person who speaks isn't at the table doesn't mean what they say is less real." She left the stage to a modest applause. Outside, a student approached and said, "Thank you. I'm going to study law." Maya smiled, the way someone who had taught herself how to read a sentence smiles when she sees a new reader being born. There were, of course, lingering debates about whether her actions had exposed the company to harm. Some argued the market destabilized. Others felt the legal system had made good on its promise to hold people accountable when they weaponized language. The truth held in the friction between these views, a reminder that accountability is messy and necessary. At her kitchen table that evening, Denise unfolded a letter from the university that included an offer for additional support for first-generation students. They read it together, a quiet celebration. Outside, the streetlight hummed. Maya placed the photocopy, now laminated and framed, on a shelf beside her textbooks. It was not a trophy. It was a reminder of responsibility and the ordinary courage that sometimes sparks lasting change. The headline that had once read, in breathless fonts, about a black girl who interrupted a boardroom became, in time, a more measured account, an example of how vigilance and the law can intersect to address harm. The descriptor "janitor's daughter" remained in some reporting, but Maya had learned to use every description on her own terms. Years later, in interviews, Jackson said he had learned to listen to the margins. Victoria continued to take cases where power tried to hide harm. Andre kept doing the quiet work that made courts trust digital evidence. Barnes kept living a life out of the spotlight, occasionally attending panels to explain how he had told the truth regardless of personal cost. And Maya, who had been, in the beginning, a teenager with a photocopy, a mother who taught caution, and a grandfather who taught the power of sentences, went back sometimes to the cleaning closet on the 27th floor. She would stand in the doorway and imagine the pen suspended over the page, the hush of a room, the way a small voice could upset a plan. The system was not fixed. It could never be fully repaired by one trial or one policy, but the measure of change was concrete. New procedures, convicted conspirators, and for one young woman, opportunities that would have once felt impossible. The fellowship in her name sent a signal that institutions could be held to a different standard. She had changed. The world had changed. That was, perhaps, the most she could ask. If you stayed with her through the whole story, consider this. Accountability often begins in places we don't expect. Support the people who speak up. Help translate questions into protections. It matters. Maya closed a textbook and turned off the lamp. In the dark, she felt the weight of the years and the light of an earned future. She had said a thing in a room full of people who thought they had the authority to shape other lives. That sentence, uttered plainly, insisted upon, had indeed changed much. She folded a small note her grandfather had written to her once. "Read the sentence. It will tell you who hurt you." She smiled, then put the note into a new drawer, closing it with a steady hand. The world, imperfect and necessary, would always need readers.